to the Scaling Japan podcast, a podcast about how to grow your business from $100,000 and beyond in the land of the rising sun.
Welcome to the Scaling Japan podcast. I'm your host, Tyson Batino, and on today's episode, we have Helen Iwata. She is the founder and president of Sasuga Communications KK, and she is the go-to communication and business leadership expert and women's success coach for multinational corporations to design and lead their high-level training and coaching programs, leveraging the power of the Sasuga success cycle. Helen has lived and worked in Japan for over 30 years, spending 10 years at McKinsey & Company as the manager of client communications and training consultants and clients in leadership and communication skills. She has been a featured speaker at TEDx Roppongi, Nikkei's Women Expo, and is also a columnist at Nikkei's Women Smart and Nikkei Doors. Did I also mention she has a book published from a major Japanese publisher and the host of the Sasuga podcast, which just hit 100,000 downloads as of June 2022. And the reason I really wanted to get you on the podcast today, Helen, was because you have been very, very successful at creating a personal brand in Japan and also setting yourself as an authority on the topic of communication and leadership. But before we dive into how you did it, I want to know a little bit more about you. So is it true that you're actually a karate champion?
It is true. It is true. World champion, 2009, Malaysia. Yes.
Gotcha. So it's not just a national state world champion.
World, yeah.
Also, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing before creating Sasuga Communications?
So directly before Sasuga Communications, I was with McKinsey for those 10 years, as you mentioned, loving all of the experiences there, the exposure to so many amazing people and so many learning opportunities. And then it got to the stage where I was like, I'm ready for a change. I'm ready to do something different. And so I left and I actually set up my business the very next day.
That was quick.
It was quick. You see, the thing is that I was very fortunate, and this is probably something that is relevant to your listeners, because I'm sure they're wanting to know about how to grow their businesses. One reason I was very fortunate is because I had a really good reputation. I developed that reputation over those years with McKinsey and also in previous companies I'd worked with. And that made it a lot easier to get started because I already had the connections and already, in my first week, I had some significant work going. So that's something for your listeners to keep in mind is your reputation.
That is a highly underrated tactic for growing your business, just having a large network, but also a solid reputation for delivering results and being trustworthy.
I mean, there's no point in having a large network if people don't really have so much experience with you, if you know what I mean. It's about the kind of, I would say, in a sense, the quality of the connections that you have that makes a difference. Because once you have a really good quality experience with one person, then that is easier to spread.
It has a multiplier effect as well. Each person they actually know what you do and can actually explain it to another person.
Yeah. I mean, I was absolutely amazed when I had one client in a certain industry, and then I received an inquiry from another client, and these are big names in the same industry. So effectively, it's that company's competitor, and yet they had received the referral from that first company's HR department. And they said, well, yeah, it's because, you're very good at what you do. And so we wanted to refer to the other HR people.
Oh, that is amazing. The less time you can spend on sales and just getting word of mouth, the more time you actually can focus on improving your system and processes and your service, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the name of your company. And what made you choose the name Sasuga Communications?
All right. So there's a little story that goes behind this, and this goes back to the McKinsey days. You know how sometimes, especially in companies, you get a kind of like an email that starts circulating. It's copied to multiple people, and it's going round and round and getting more and more complicated as it goes. And there was an email that was like that, and one of the partners was copied on it and said, "Can someone explain what on earth is going on here?" It was something like that. So I just wrote back and I was like, this is the issue and these are the 3 supporting points, or whatever it was. It was just like I just did a real quick structured summary. And the partner wrote back immediately and he's like, Sasuga communication expert. And I was like, oh, that is such a great name. Because that was just at the point where I'd already decided that I was leaving and I was thinking about what would be good for a business name.
And let's say that was your role in the company, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I was the communication expert.
Yeah, just in that one email, like you communicated exactly what your job description was.
Exactly.
I would say you're a little bit ubiquitous on the internet for Japan. It's,
that's a good one.
And I would say it doesn't happen overnight, but
No.
yeah, so you're all over the place on social media. So I would really kind of want to pick your brain on, how you have leveraged social media successfully,
Right.
to really establish yourself as a brand and authority in Japan.
I would say, first of all, that social media, it's constantly changing. So I'm constantly learning here. And so it's so funny because a lot of people look at me and they're like, oh, Helen, you know everything. So it's almost like that. But I'm always learning. Even, more about communication skills, about women's success skills, but also like the business side of things and the social media. So the main platforms that I'm active on are Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram and YouTube. I would say they're probably the main ones. Right now, I'm focusing a lot more on Instagram. And the reason there is because I enjoy it. That's something to me that's very important in your business, because if you're doing things that you don't enjoy, it's really, really hard to keep going. And you're not having a good energy around it. So for me, Instagram is fun. And especially, with Reels now, it's kind of almost like a hobby is doing the Reels part of it.
So yeah, I think the Reels is one tactic. I guess the good question is maybe what type of businesses do you think maybe using Instagram would be good for in a B2B aspect?
Well, so maybe if I can just sort of tweak the question, if you don't mind, because
Go for it.
What I would say to the listeners is, where is your target audience? Because there's no point in using Instagram if the people that you want to reach are not using Instagram. So that's the first thing to look at, is where are people? I was quite happy to discover that there are a reasonable number of my target audience on Instagram. A lot of the time I was thinking they're on Facebook to start with. LinkedIn some years ago didn't seem very popular in Japan, but it really seems to have grown a lot recently. So I'm considering as well, like a little bit different strategy on LinkedIn. So think about where your target audience is and also what you enjoy. And then when you've got that combination, that's where to focus. So right now, like for instance, when posting on something like Facebook, my business posts on Facebook are kind of just like a basic version of what's on Instagram, but not really putting as much sort of effort into that, if you know what I mean. The focus is more on the Instagram, the kind of where I'm being really intentional about what I'm putting out there.
To clarify, what percentage are you focusing on maybe Japanese versus non-Japanese clients?
I would say that the majority of my clients, especially in the women's success area, are Japanese women working in global businesses, which could be corporations or could also be entrepreneurs. And if you put a percentage on that, more than 80%, I would say. I also have non-Japanese women in that same description, working in corporate or as entrepreneurs. And then there are male Japanese who tend to come to me more for the communication skills and leadership. And then some non-Japanese males as well.
So that's interesting that Instagram has been a successful platform for that, because I think when people think Instagram, they immediately think to sell like a product.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's kind of great for products because it's so visual. At the same time, it's great also for coaching type businesses, because what's really important in a coaching type business, in my view, is the kind of the whole know, like, and trust factor. KLT, know, like, and trust. You want your clients to know who you are, to like you, and to trust you. That's something that's talked about quite a lot, I would say, in the online world. But actually, this might be a useful little formula for your listeners, something that I learned years ago when I was first with McKinsey. I was given a book to read called The Trusted Advisor. And there's a concept in there called the trust equation, which I think it's just so simple and so powerful. So everybody get your pen out, take notes on this, because you don't have to buy the book. Buy one of my books. So you mentioned my book, Eigo no Shigoto Jutsu, which is the first book, and my new book is in the works, but we can talk about that later. So the equation itself is T equals C plus R plus I over S. So I hope everyone's written that down to help you kind of visualize it and make it easy to understand. If I talk you through each of those, T is trust. So it's basically what makes trust. And this is something that is so important, I would say, to your listeners. This is absolutely crucial, because it's when you have trust, that's what really helps you to grow your business. Trust is equal to C is credibility. So your credibility is your expertise, your experience in whatever business it is. So I feel tremendously fortunate, because in terms of that credibility, as soon as I say McKinsey, many people go, oh, yes, instant credibility. So for your listeners, I would say, consider what is it that makes you credible. It could be something to do with your qualifications, although sometimes qualifications in a sense are overrated, because people might not really know what that qualification actually means. And does it have prestige around it, that kind of thing? How long you've been in a certain industry, who you've worked with, those kind of things. That's all around the credibility. And it's about allowing people to know these things without necessarily being in your face, bragging, boasting sort of thing, but not being shy about it. Because a lot of people, especially the entrepreneurs that I see, they tend to be a little shy about their area of expertise and the credibility piece. So that's number one, is the credibility. And then the R, so C plus R is reliability. And this is do what you say you are going to do. Do a good job. And this is what we were talking about in terms of you do a good job, and that's what builds that reputation for you. People are going to then refer you to others. Okay, so make sure you do a good job. And then the I is intimacy. And this is in terms of how open you are and how people can get to know you. So this is where social media is great, like Instagram, because people can really see you and kind of experience you there, not just delivering your expertise, but they can experience snippets of who you are as a person. This is why I love doing Instagram Reels, for example, because I can do a little bit of my funny and playful side on there as well, and just like be the real, authentic me. So you've got C plus R plus I over is divided by S. So obviously those top ones, the higher they are, the higher your score. If you say like score out of 10 for each of those, the higher they are, the better. And then it's divided by S. S is self-orientation. So that's like how much you're focusing on yourself. And the way I look at it, there's kind of two ways of considering self-orientation. One is like, if you imagine, like the sort of sleazy salesperson where they're just in it for the sale. They don't care about the relationship. They just want to get your money, right?
Yes, I think everyone can relate to that.
Right? That's one type of self-orientation, because it's just like they're into what's in it for me kind of thing. The other type of self-orientation is when the person is really self-conscious and worried about what people will think of them. The higher your self-orientation score, if you like say out of 10, the more it's going to lower the overall trust score, right?
Makes sense.
And it's so, so powerful. So like in terms of presentation skills, I say to people, it's all about the audience. Your attention wants to be on the audience, not on how nervous you feel.
Yeah, it's always people, they have that covet. It's like, it's my first time speaking, or they're just more interested. Are they really going to get their values worth for this 60 minutes? You saying that is going to decrease their confidence that this is a good investment of their time.
Exactly. I learned that formula, as I said, years ago, and I refer to it all the time. And it's one of the things that I'm always sharing it with other people because I want others to get that value from it.
Like what you're listening to and ready to scale your company? Let Tyson coach you and your team to make the jump. You can find more information about our coaching and advisory services at www.scalingyourcompany.com. Now, back to our podcast.
I really love that formula because in terms of scaling Japan or like scaling your company for my coaching and advisory, it's I like to think of things that create multiple effects. The trust score can actually lead to a multiple. Like, the higher your trust score, the more potential clients you could get.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, you could potentially get a lot of clients initially, but without the trust, they're not going to stay. In terms of growing your business, it's a lot easier to grow from the existing clients than from getting new clients, for many businesses anyway.
When people start leaving, they focus overly on just trying to generate more and more sales, as opposed to really just focusing on building and solidifying that trust from the current customer base.
So I'm part of an online business group, Female Entrepreneurs, and a term that comes up a lot there is churn and burn. So a lot of sales is about you just like go through as many people as you want and just forget about the relationships. And that is just not the way as far as I'm concerned.
And I think a lot of people in the audience, let's say, hopefully they've taken notes and just really self-reflect on evaluating yourself and giving yourself a score. But do you have any tips on how to self-evaluate oneself using this framework?
I would say no need to overthink. Just basically for each of those, the C, the credibility, the R, reliability, I, intimacy, and the S, self-orientation, just say to yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, what would I score myself? Oh, let me give you like an example, because this is something I was talking about with the Sasuga Mastermind is the highest level group that I have. And one of the women in there has recently started with a new company. And so in terms of credibility, when you're going into a new company, or, for your listeners as well, if they're going into a new environment, a new potential client, you're not going to necessarily have a high C score right from the start. That's something that you develop. You might specifically look at that and you might think, okay, they know a little bit about me, so maybe right now my credibility is a 3 out of 10. That then gives you the awareness that that's a great area for you to focus on. Okay, now how can I let them know without it coming across as boasting that I actually have more credibility, I have more expertise? And then same with reliability, you can look at yourself and say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much am I actually fulfilling on what I've said that I'm going to do? And I would hope that everybody can be pretty high on that one. Otherwise, I mean, that's totally everybody's own responsibility. To me, that's just such an easy fix. If you say you're going to do it, then do it.
And I think that's something people could potentially even survey current customers. I mean, they wouldn't say it maybe that directly, but finding a way to actually analyze what is your current reliability. Some people, they use like ENPS score, like, would you recommend a friend? If they say 7, that means a no.
Yeah, exactly.
And if they say 9 out of 10, they'll definitely, they are fans of the service.
Yeah, and it could be like just simply, satisfaction, how satisfied are you with the service or product?
Yeah, what I really like about that framework is you could evaluate yourself, kind of see what areas you're strong in, what areas you're weak. Then you focus on the weakest area and constantly build up your score.
Yeah. And at the same time, remember your strengths. This is something that I'm so passionate about. I did a Sasuga podcast episode on this about, recognizing your strengths. And I would say, especially in Japan, there can be a big focus on weaknesses and the whole idea of identifying your weaknesses and improving on them, which, yes, you can do that, but you can actually be really difficult, and you can potentially spend a lot of time and effort and make a small amount of progress. Whereas if you had focused on what are your natural strengths, build more on those, and then also looking for support to help you in those areas where you may have a weakness. So there's a great book called, I think it's called Find the Who, which is really about, stop wasting time doing things that you're not good at. and find someone who can help you with that. It's time to find a who.
When you're an entrepreneur, there's so many things you have to do, but do you really have the time to learn things, do trial and error?
Exactly. I mean, it's a tricky one because also I would say another danger for entrepreneurs is you can go like overboard in finding your who's and then have massive great expenses. So there is that case of, looking at what makes sense when you are in the early stages of your business. Well, not just in the early stages of business, in any stage of your business, just keeping an eye on both sides of the balance sheet.
No, I definitely agree. And I think when you get into the realm of technology and finance,
Yeah.
and let's say you're going to have gaps, you will need people's help. But because of the complexity of what you're dealing in, let's say that leads to tendency of spending too much, but also leaves areas where you could potentially be deceived.
What do you mean by deceived?
In the case of finances, it's like for someone, they're like, I'm just going to get someone to run all my accounting for me. Like, I don't want to look at the numbers.
Right.
It's too stressful. Then I've talked to entrepreneurs where they had a successful business, then all of a sudden money was siphoned out of the business gradually over time. And like, just because they didn't look at it.
Yeah.
In the tech case, it's people saying like, oh, it's going to take more time. There are all these issues, but the entrepreneur, they didn't really understand it. So they just accepted the information people gave them as fact.
Yeah.
And it blew up in their faces, unfortunately. I think this thing, if you just do this one thing alone, it will open so many other doors.
Absolutely.
For media, I think, especially probably for the listeners who's been here like 10, 20 years, they're like, I should be on Nikkei too. But if you had any tips or maybe like how you got involved in writing for the media, or also maybe some tips for listeners who would potentially want to be featured in the media.
That's a really tricky one. I would actually say it's not my full area of expertise, and I can only share what's been my experience there. And it really does come back to the whole trust equation in terms of relationships. Originally, one of the members in my team at McKinsey, who then introduced me to someone else, who then introduced me to someone else. And that was the person who was at Nikkei Online. And then they asked me if I would consider doing the first column, and then a couple of years later, the second column.
I had a hunch that we were going to go back to the framework.
Yeah, it really does go back to the relationships part. Yeah, the real core, I would say, of the growing your business.
So we've heard about, let's say, Instagram, also one just being reliable and providing a high quality service. What got you interested in starting a podcast, since you already had trust, you had credibility, you had reputation or reliability?
I think it was just something that people in my circle of the online entrepreneur friends that I have, it was something that was being talked about. And I thought, okay, I'll give that a go, which is also a big part of my attitude. And I think maybe what's helped a lot is that I do have an attitude of let's give it a go, see what happens, which some entrepreneurs can have difficulty with because they want to get perfection. They want it to be absolutely right before they will go ahead. And I was just like, let's do it and see what happens. So going back and listening to the first episode is like, oh, cringe. But it was just like absolute basics and get it there. It was just basically something that people were talking about. And I thought, let's give it a go.
In my case, bringing it back to the framework, I would say I probably had credibility, or I did feel that I had credibility already because I've created 2 successful companies and people would give me the benefit of the doubt there. But for the podcast itself, I think for me, it was more on the trust element. And my thinking behind that was, so they might see the accolades, PR releases, but if they do listen to me on a weekly basis and they do see that I'm providing good insights, just the way that I interact with guests, that it would create more trust. They may become customers or they'll reach out to me and I could introduce them to the person that could help them out the most.
Yeah, it relates exactly back to the trust equation because you talked about the credibility. You're demonstrating your credibility when you're on your podcast. You're being reliable by releasing the podcast on a regular basis. The intimacy part, people are getting to know you. They're hearing you on a regular basis. And the self-orientation as a podcaster, you kind of have to lower your self-orientation because you are putting yourself out there so much. So, yeah.
For the audience listening, it's one benefit of doing a podcast is you can also do post-podcast editing. So you sound like a master. but that's
Well, that's a great one that you bring up there, because on the Sasaga podcast, I actually rarely edit. Very, very rarely. And certainly I don't edit anyway. That's also have a who, because I have one of my team members do the editing if needed, but it's very, very rare because I really want to come across as the real me, the authentic me. And something in terms of, like, for example, communication skills and presentation skills, a lot of people are so obsessed with sounding perfect, sounding sophisticated. Little side story here. This is one of my clients who actually I'm coaching this afternoon as well after this session. And he is the newly appointed Japan head of a global business. And in the very first session that I had with him, with some of his, his high-ranking colleagues, we were talking about what sort of type of person that he wants to be, words to describe the type of person that he wants to be. He came up with sophisticated, right? He's Japanese, by the way. And he came up as he wants to be seen as sophisticated. And his colleagues were like, no, 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 no. Because I was also thinking no. And his colleagues were, no, 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 no. What we want to see is authentic. And I was like, excellent. So, so happy that we had this call with them on as well, because if it's just me saying that, it's, that's just me saying that. But when it's got his colleagues, very high ranking colleagues, that was really, really powerful. So, which kind of gets me back to the whole point of whether you edit your podcast or not. And, people do whichever they prefer. But I will leave in parts where I will trip over my words, for example, because I want to demonstrate that you don't have to be perfect. And when you're presenting, when you're communicating, if you trip over your words a little bit, that's normal, that's natural. It makes you a human being, and it actually makes you more relatable and likable.
I agree 100%. Luckily, in my case, I actually don't like editing. So that's the easiest way, or the discomfort of maybe not sounding sophisticated is less than the pain of having to do the editing. So It always works out in my case. But not to take away, you made a very profound statement in that it's a very good opportunity for people to provide that intimacy. And a lot of people aren't actually expecting you to be perfect all the time. And if you are kind of, in some cases, it might actually create a suspicion.
Yeah, it creates a distance. Right. And it's that whole, like, when people are being perfect, that's the self-orientation part is really high. And so that lowers the overall trust score.
Cool. I probably need to hear that too, because I'm very self-conscious. Like, I realize I say, I like to think a lot.
That's an interesting one. Like, so many of my clients come with that whole concern about how many ums and ahs they say. Look there, I just did it. You see? And did the...
It's contagious. It's contagious.
Was it a problem? Was it a problem? No, you do it. It's normal. And the thing is that people, they get concerned, especially if they hear themselves back, on a recording or something, and they're like, oh, I said and so much. The thing is that most people, when they're listening to you, they're not really paying attention to that, because it's a natural part of, as we're speaking and we're thinking. So occasionally it's like really, really pronounced. And that's usually with someone who's very, very focused, very, very self-oriented. But for the most part, it's not so much of a big deal. And when you start to focus on something else, those ums and ahs will lessen, they'll decrease.
I thought people really cared about it, but usually the only feedback I got was, Tyson, you need to improve your audio. And no one really commented on the I thought that would be the biggest. Like, you say and way too much, but it was more like, I think you need to improve your audio settings. And it's like, oh, cool. It's a relief off my shoulders.
Yep.
Actually, I was planning to ask about word of mouth, but you introducing this framework pretty much answered the question, that the more trust that you get, credibility, reliability, intimacy, and the more that you put yourself out there, word of mouth is just going to naturally happen, because let's say if you're really reliable and people can trust you, why wouldn't they introduce you to their friends?
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess, this has been a really useful episode for myself included. And thank you for your time. And do you have any asks or more information you could tell us about where we could find you and what you offer?
There's a lot of stuff there. I would say the first point, because people listening are podcast listeners. So if you would like to hear more from me, go listen to the Sasaga podcast. It should be easy enough to find in your podcast player. If you are interested, also, I mentioned very, very briefly that I'm working on my second book, and that is Less Effort, More Impact. And I have a URL, I have a page for the kind of the beginnings of that. It's lesseffortbook.com. So if you're interested in the journey as we lead up to the publication of that, go and have a look at lesseffortbook.com.
And also, could you mention, I know you do some masterminds?
Right. The Sasaga Mastermind is a group for women only, and it's like a very, very high level group. I also have the the Sasaga VIP Women's Coaching Program, which is a 3-month program for women. Next one coming up in September of 2022. There is an interest list for that, sasagacommunications.com/VIP. You can link to it. Yeah.
So we will link to everything, but there is a potential waiting list. So I definitely recommend if anyone's interested, jump on that.
Assuming you're on Instagram, just DM me if there's something that you want to know about, because that way I can tailor to whatever it is that you're particularly want to know more about.
So we'll feature a link to everything. And thank you so much for your time, Helen.
You are most welcome, Tyson. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's so much fun having a conversation like this. Thank you.